It took me a long time to understand something I didn't have the words for back then. It wasn't what I heard that changed my life. It was what I couldn't stop hearing afterward. In those days, I still believed the town was exactly what it looked like in daylight. I believed folks were mostly what they said they were. Working men who left early and came home with their collars damp at the throat. Women who kept kitchens running like clocks and knew which child belonged to which cough. Store owners with their hands always smelling like paper, tobacco, or bread. People who stood in the same places after church, talking about the weather like it was the only thing that ever truly surprised anyone. In a small town, people used to say, "Nothing stays hidden for long." And I said it too. I said it because it sounded right, and because I had no reason to doubt it. A place that's small feels like it has no room for secrets. Everybody knows everybody. Everybody knows where you were raised, who your people are, which road you live on, what kind of car you drive, how you take your coffee. I didn't understand then that a town like that doesn't get rid of secrets. It just learns how to carry them. My job helped the town carry them. The telephone exchange sat in a plain building not far from the center of things, but not right in the middle either. Close enough that the lines ran clean, far enough that nobody stood around in front of it unless they had a reason. People walked by like it was a utility shed, like it held nothing but tools and spare parts. That suited the place. That suited the work. If you'd never been inside, you might have imagined it was just a room with some equipment and a few women answering calls like in the movies. But our exchange was an older kind of work, the kind that didn't make for much of a show. It was wood and metal and routine. It was cords hanging in heavy loops and little lights blinking in orderly rows, and a board that looked like a map if you knew how to read it. I sat in front of that switchboard for most of my days. Dark wood polished by years of hands. Rows of numbered jacks. Thick cords with dull metal tips. Each number belonged to a house, a shop, the post office, the doctor, the hardware store, the church office. Every line in town had its place. A light would blink, and that meant somebody was calling in. I'd reach for the cord, plug in, and connect them to whoever they asked for. Another plug, another click, and then two voices met somewhere out in the world, like I'd opened a door between two rooms. Then I unplugged, set the cord back in its place, and moved on. That was the whole job, or that's what it looked like. The truth is, the job wasn't only in the hands, it was in the restraint. You had to be quick, yes. Accurate, yes. But mostly, you had to be the kind of person who could stand in the middle of other people's lives and leave no footprints. You weren't supposed to have a face in it. You weren't supposed to have an opinion. You weren't supposed to have a memory. That wasn't written on the wall, but it might as well have been. There were rules everybody understood, whether they spoke them out loud or not. Don't comment on what you hear. Don't mention names. Don't tell your husband. Don't tell your wife. Don't tell your best friend after supper like it's a piece of gossip you're trading for another. You connect the call. You disappear. That's the work, and I took pride in that, the way a man takes pride in doing something right that nobody notices because it's done right. I believed in being steady, in not making a fuss, in not inserting myself where I didn't belong. Some days I said almost nothing. Yes, ma'am. One moment. Go ahead. A voice like a doorknob. There when you needed it. Invisible when you didn't. I'd come home and realize I hadn't used my own voice for anything that mattered all day long. I thought that was a good sign. I thought it meant I was doing the job the way it ought to be done. What passes through the lines doesn't belong to you, I told myself. I said it the way you say a prayer you learned young, because you've said it enough times to believe it. But a telephone line doesn't carry only words. It carries a person's breathing. It carries the pause before a name. It carries the way somebody tries to sound calm when they aren't. At first, I didn't notice those things like a thought. I noticed them like a body notices cold air coming under a door, a faint discomfort, a sense that something was off by a fraction, a call at a time that didn't quite fit, a voice using a tone that didn't match the request, the kind of thing you can shrug off if you want to. And I did shrug it off. I told myself I was tired. I told myself I was imagining patterns, because the days were repetitive, and the mind likes to entertain itself. I told myself it wasn't my place to think about what anyone was doing on the other end of those wires. Who was I to read into other people's lives? I was the man at the board. That was it. The problem is patterns don't require your permission. They keep showing up whether you want them to or not. After a while, voices started becoming familiar in a way that surprised me. Not the words. Voices themselves. I could tell who it was by how they cleared their throat, by how they said operator, by how they held a breath at the end of a sentence. Some folks talked fast, like they were rushing through a doorway and didn't want to get caught inside. Some talked slow, like they were trying to keep the line open just a little longer, like they were reluctant to be alone with their thoughts. There were people who always sounded polite, no matter what hour it was. There were others who were friendly in daylight, but turned careful at night. There were some who never said names, only numbers, like names were too heavy to put on the wire. None of that meant anything on its own, but it repeated. That's what got under my skin. Not one strange call, but the repetition. Certain calls started coming in after 9 at night, and it was always the same voices, always the same careful manner. Not warm, not cold, formal in a way that felt practiced, like two people who knew each other well were pretending they didn't. Those calls weren't long, but they had a particular kind of pause in them, a pause that wasn't confusion, a pause that was caution. Then there were the calls that came early, too early, before most folks had even put coffee on. Those voices were low, not soft like tired, low like hiding. Even when the person was alone, they spoke like somebody might be listening through a wall. You tell yourself that's nothing. In a bigger place, maybe it would be nothing. But in a small town, there isn't much noise to cover what doesn't belong. Anything out of place rings loud. What bothered me wasn't that I was hearing scandal. What bothered me was the feeling that I was hearing the town's underside. During the day, the town had its face on. Men shook hands on the sidewalk. Women compared prices and recipes. People talked about school events and the weather, and whose cousin had gotten a job out of state. Everything seemed orderly, sensible, and more or less honest. But at night, the wires carried different kinds of conversations. Not always dramatic, not always sinful, just different. The sort of talk that never shows up in daylight. The sort of talk that doesn't get repeated in a line outside the grocery store. And the thing that made it hard was this. I didn't go looking for any of it. It came to me. I kept connecting calls because that was my job. Nobody asked me to listen. Nobody asked me to remember. Nobody asked me to put anything together. But when you sit in one place long enough and the whole town passes through you in pieces, your mind starts making its own sense of the pieces. There was one night, nothing special about it. And that's why I remember it, when I realized I wasn't just hearing anymore. I was anticipating. Before certain lights even blinked, I found myself already reaching for the right chord. Before someone finished asking for a number, I knew where the call was headed. I could feel the shape of the evening by the first few requests. The way you can tell a storm is coming by how the air sits heavy and still. That should have been a harmless kind of experience. It was just familiarity with the work. But it didn't feel harmless. It put a cold stone in my stomach. Not because I'd uncovered some forbidden secret, because I recognized the town in a way that didn't feel natural. It's one thing to know people by sight. It's another thing to know them by the way their voices change when they think no one can see them. I went home that night and tried to be normal. My wife noticed I was quiet, quieter than usual. She asked if I was tired. I told her I was. That wasn't a lie. It just didn't explain the kind of tiredness it was. I sat at the table, got what she put down, listened to the radio playing low like it always did. The house looked the same. The chair I always sat in was under me. The lamp threw the same soft light on the same walls. Everything was in its place, and yet I felt like something had come home with me, something I couldn't set down. When I went to bed, sleep didn't come easy. I lay there listening, not to the town, not to the phone, but to the quiet, and inside that quiet, I felt the echo of voices I'd connected hours earlier, like the wires had run straight through my chest and hadn't been unplugged. That was the first time I understood, without being able to name it, that something had started. Not an incident, not a scandal, a process. And once a process begins, it doesn't ask your permission. The next morning I went back to work. Same building, same board, same chords, same blinking lights. The town waking up the way it always did. Everything looked the same, but I wasn't exactly the same man sitting down at that switchboard. And later, much later, I would understand that was the beginning of everything. The town woke up early, but it never woke up all at once. Some houses showed light before 6. Almost always the same one. People who lived by the clock, more than by the sun. Others took longer. There were whole streets that stayed quiet until after 7. When the first cars rolled through at a speed that wasn't quite hurry, and wasn't quite leisure either. It was the kind of movement you learn to recognize when you've watched it long enough. From inside the exchange, I could tell how the morning was unfolding without ever looking outside. The telephone had its own way of measuring life. The first calls of the day were almost never long. They were practical. Someone letting another person know they'd be late. A store checking on a delivery. A reminder to wake somebody up. The town lining itself up for the day ahead. The exchange wasn't a place for conversation. It was a place for passage. People didn't come there to talk. They came there to get things moving. And once things were moving, nobody thought much about the place they passed through on the way. There were rules to the work. Even if very few of them were written down anywhere, you learned them by watching and by staying long enough to understand what was expected of you. Don't comment on calls. Don't react to what you hear. Don't let curiosity slow your hands. What moves through the lines is not yours to carry home. I respected that. I always had. Maybe that's why I lasted as long as I did. I wasn't the oldest man there. But I wasn't new either. I'd started back when the job still required real training. You had to memorize numbers, learn the board, develop speed, without losing accuracy. It wasn't work for someone careless or easily distracted. One small mistake could interrupt an important call, delay a decision, cause confusion. And in a town like ours, confusion always found its way back to the same places. Over time, people stopped double-checking my work. They trusted that if I was on shift, things would run the way they were supposed to. That kind of trust doesn't come with praise. It comes with silence. Nobody notices when everything goes right. I liked it that way. The building itself had a smell you didn't notice until it was gone. Old wood, dust settled deep into corners, warm metal. To someone walking in for the first time, it probably felt cramped and dull. To me, it felt almost alive. Every click, every faint vibration, every irregular sound meant something. I could tell when a cord was wearing out before it failed. I could hear when a connection wasn't clean. That familiarity gave me a sense of control. It was a false sense, but I didn't know that yet. During the daytime, the town felt predictable. Calls followed patterns that made sense. Certain businesses always called at certain hours. Some homes rarely made long calls at all. There were people who hardly ever reached outside the town, as if the world ended right at the edge of it. Others made regular calls far away, maybe to remind themselves that there was something beyond the roads they drove every day. None of that troubled me at first. It was simply how things were. What changed slowly, so slowly I didn't notice it right away, was the way the phone behaved after dark. At night, the calls lasted longer. Voices dropped. People paused more. The requests became less direct. Someone would start to say something, stop, then try again in a different way. Some people hung up before completing the call, like they'd decided at the last second not to go through with it. The tone of the town shifted when the sun went down. I began to understand that the town lived by two rhythms, one that belonged to daylight, visible and familiar, and another that only existed when most folks were home, doors locked, curtains drawn. It was during those hours that the phone stopped being just a tool. It became a place. I noticed small contradictions. People who barely acknowledged each other on the street spoke with easy familiarity late at night. Folks who seemed to have nothing in common shared long calls spaced carefully through the week. Their voices carried a kind of recognition that didn't match their public distance. At first, I told myself I was just becoming more observant with age. Anyone who does the same job long enough starts noticing finer details. I framed it that way because it was harmless. It kept things simple, but simplicity didn't hold for long. I started to feel like the town I heard through the wires was more complete than the town I saw with my eyes. Not better, not worse, just fuller, like hearing both sides of a conversation instead of one. And I was the only one hearing both sides. What struck me most was how little anyone thought about the exchange itself. People complained if a line was busy. They complained if a call dropped, but nobody talked about the process. Nobody paused to consider how many conversations passed through the same place before reaching their destination. The exchange worked best when it wasn't thought about at all. I began to realize how much the town depended on that invisibility. Business deals, private arrangements, difficult conversations that people didn't want to have face to face. The telephone allowed things to happen quietly, without witnesses, without explanations. And I was the constant presence in all of it. That realization didn't come with drama. It came with accumulation, day after day, small observations stacked up. A tone here, a pause there. A call that only made sense if you remembered another call from 2 days earlier. I wasn't trying to assemble a story. My mind just did what minds do when given repetition. It organized. There were moments when I left work with a strange sense of having watched something move, without ever seeing it clearly, like standing near a river at night and hearing the current but not seeing the water. You know it's there. You know it's strong. But you can't point to a single wave and say, that one matters more than the rest. The town during the day felt flat by comparison. The same greetings, the same topics, the same polite exchanges. I didn't think people were lying exactly. They were just presenting the version of themselves that fit the light. At night, through the phone, those versions softened. That didn't make them worse. It made them human. Still, there was something unsettling about realizing how much of the town existed only in that second rhythm. How many decisions were shaped in voices meant to be heard by as few people as possible. I didn't go to work looking for this. I didn't sit down expecting to uncover anything. I adjusted the board, answered the lights, moved the cords. The connections came to me, and with them came the repetitions. At some point, I began thinking about calls after they ended. Not what was said, but that they had happened, when they happened, why they happened then. I'd catch myself doing it and force my thoughts elsewhere. I reminded myself of my role. I wasn't paid to interpret. I was paid to connect. But attention, once sharpened, doesn't dull easily. I started to understand that the town depended on people not seeing the full picture. That things worked because no single person held all the pieces. Everyone carried a fragment. I just happened to be in a position where many fragments passed through me. That didn't make me powerful. It made me uneasy. There were days when I felt like I was standing in the center of a wheel, watching spokes turn without ever touching the rim. Essential, but unseen. Necessary, but not acknowledged. I hadn't yet realized how much that position would cost me. At the time, it just felt like a growing discomfort. Something I couldn't quite explain or dismiss. The town hadn't changed. The job hadn't changed. But the way I understood both of them had. And once understanding shifts, It doesn't slide back into place on its own. I was still telling myself everything was normal, but somewhere deep down, I already knew that the phone had stopped being just a line between two people. It had become a map, and I was learning how to read it. At first, I told myself it was nothing more than habit. Anyone who does the same work long enough starts noticing small things. That's how I explained it. Familiarity sharpens the eye, sharpens the ear. You stop thinking about each action and start sensing what comes next. There was nothing dangerous in that idea. It sounded reasonable. It let me stay calm. Certain calls came in at certain times. That was normal. People live by routines. They always have. What unsettled me wasn't the routines themselves, but how carefully some of them avoided each other. There was a woman who called almost every Wednesday night, always after 8:30. Her voice was steady, polite, never rushed. During the day, she was known as someone reserved, almost distant, the kind of person who didn't linger in conversation. At night, over the phone, there was something else in her voice. Not warmth, not excitement, decision. As if that call had already been made in her mind long before she ever picked up the receiver. There was a man who called early on certain mornings, too early for comfort, a small business owner, well known. In public, he was confident, talkative. On the phone at that hour, his voice dropped. He spoke softly, even though he was alone. He never said full names. He asked for connections quickly, like he wanted the call finished before it had fully begun. When the conversation ended, he often stayed silent for a second or two before hanging up, as if weighing whether he'd said too much. None of this meant anything by itself, but it repeated. I started to notice that some of these calls never crossed paths with others. They occupied very specific spaces in the day, as if someone had taken care to keep them from overlapping, and when two of them did come close to colliding, one simply didn't happen. At first, I didn't connect those details. I registered them the way you register the sound of a step that always creaks in the same place. You don't avoid the step. You just expect the noise. I kept treating each call as its own thing. I made a point of that. It was my way of holding on to the code I'd always lived by. Every caller received the same tone, the same efficiency, the same neutral presence. I didn't want anyone to sense a difference in me, but the difference was already there. I began recognizing voices before they finished asking for a line. It wasn't guessing, it was memory, the rhythm of a sentence, the way someone inhaled before speaking, the slight hesitation before a request that shouldn't require hesitation. I always realized it a moment after it happened, and that realization made me uncomfortable, not because I was doing anything wrong, but because that familiarity had never been invited. It had settled in on its own. There were calls that ended too abruptly. People who hung up fast, like they'd crossed an invisible line. Others lingered in their goodbyes, stretching out the final seconds, as if they needed reassurance that what had been said had landed properly. I began to understand something slowly. The telephone wasn't just a tool, it was a space, a place where people allowed themselves to be slightly different than they were in daylight. That realization didn't make me feel important. It made me feel exposed. Some days I left the exchange with the sense that I'd spent hours watching something move, without ever seeing its shape clearly. Not events, motion. A kind of underground current, not criminal, not dramatic, just hidden by choice. When I walked through town afterward, the streets looked the same. Same storefronts, same faces, same brief greetings. But when I thought about what I'd heard during the day, the picture no longer lined up perfectly. It was like looking at an old photograph and suddenly noticing someone in the background you'd never seen before. The strange thing was that I wasn't looking for any of this. I didn't arrive at work expecting to discover patterns. I sat down, adjusted the board, and followed the lights as they came on. The calls brought themselves to me, and with them came repetition. There was one afternoon when two calls came in less than an hour apart. Different people, different addresses, but the tone was the same contained urgency, the same careful phrasing, the same pause before disconnecting. I couldn't have explained how I knew that those two calls were related. I just knew. I That stayed with me longer than it should have, not because it shocked me, but because it felt rehearsed. Too deliberate to be coincidence, like hearing the same phrase spoken by different mouths. I began to wonder whether the town had always functioned this way, and I'd simply never noticed, or whether something had shifted recently. There was no clear answer. And maybe there didn't need to be one. Maybe this was just what happened when someone listened long enough without being seen. I found myself imagining where the calls went after they left the exchange, the houses they entered, the rooms where people sat with the receiver close to their mouth, kitchens with lights left on late, doors closed, curtains drawn, not as scenes of drama, but as continuation. The phone wasn't the event. It was the opening. That troubled me more than any single secret could have. Secrets end when they're revealed. Patterns don't. Some days I made a deliberate effort not to pay attention. I focused strictly on the mechanics of the work, the chords, the timing, the board. But the harder I tried to ignore what I'd already noticed, the clearer it became that my mind had organized those details without asking me first. I didn't judge anyone. At least, I don't think I did. I understood that every town has its unspoken arrangements, ways of keeping things running without stirring the surface. What unsettled me was realizing that I was, unintentionally, positioned at the center of those arrangements. I started to sense that some people were more careful when they called, not because of me personally, but because they were aware, on some level, that there was always someone in the middle, an unseen presence. Neutral, but real. That awareness tightened their voices, made their words more precise. Others seemed to forget entirely. They spoke freely, as if the phone created a private space by default, as if the line erased the fact that voices had to pass through hands before reaching their destination. That difference repeated too. Little by little, I understood that I wasn't just hearing conversations. I was hearing decisions being shaped, small choices, hesitations, confirmations, nothing big enough to become a headline, nothing small enough to be meaningless. And that realization began to weigh on me, not as fear, as pressure. I still slept, I still worked, I still spoke to people normally. But there were moments when I caught myself anticipating calls, expecting certain voices, feeling a strange sense of absence when they didn't come, like something had slipped out of place. That's when it became clear to me that the patterns no longer lived on the switchboard. They lived in me, and once something settles there, it doesn't leave quietly. I understood then, without saying it out loud, that this wasn't a passing phase. It wasn't fatigue. It wasn't imagination. It was the beginning of a more organized way of seeing the town. A way that couldn't be undone simply by deciding not to look. And once you begin to see a place like that, you don't get the option of pretending you never did. You just keep going, waiting to find out how far it reaches. At some point, it stopped being just listening. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a moment I could point to and say, this is where it changed. It was more like walking the same road for years and suddenly realizing you know every bend without having to look. The road had always been there. What changed was how it lived inside me. I was no longer hearing calls one by one. I was hearing sequences. A call from the night before only made sense because of another one that had come 2 days earlier. A simple request in the morning carried weight when it repeated the following week, at the exact same hour, with the same contained urgency. Voices stopped arranging themselves in my memory as individuals. They began arranging themselves as parts of something larger, and that frightened me more than any single secret ever could have. I started noticing that certain people functioned like fixed points. They were always there, always available. Others appeared only when something needed to be settled. Some called to confirm, some called to authorize, some only called after everything had already been decided. None of these roles were official. None of them were written down anywhere. But they repeated with enough precision that coincidence no longer explained them. That was when I began to understand something I hadn't seen before. The telephone didn't just carry conversation. It carried hierarchy. There were voices that never asked. They informed. Others always asked, even when it was clear they already knew the answer. Some people spoke very little, but when they did, other voices adjusted quickly. Others talked too much, maybe trying to compensate for the fact that they didn't truly hold any weight. None of this came with drama. That was the unsettling part. Everything was practical, ordinary, functional. Decisions were shaped quietly, without raised voices or strong language. That was what made it harder to dismiss. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't scandal. This was organization. The town I heard through the phone wasn't stumbling its way forward. It was moving with care. I began to realize that many small changes, delays, altered plans, meetings that never happened, didn't appear out of nowhere. They were prepared in advance, stitched together through brief calls, spread out across the day like messages that only made sense to the people who knew how to read them. I didn't know how to read them completely, but I heard enough. There were days when I caught myself anticipating consequences. A call would come in, and I would already sense what it might set in motion hours later. Sometimes I was wrong, sometimes I wasn't, but the fact that my mind had started making those connections told me how far things had gone. I was no longer neutral on the inside. Neutrality requires distance, and I was too close. I started seeing people in two registers, the version they carried into daylight and the version that came through the phone. They weren't different people. They were adjusted versions of the same person, shaped by context. The town seemed to allow that quietly, almost politely, and maybe it always had. The more I connected these voices, the more I understood that the town ran on unspoken agreements. Not necessarily bad ones, not necessarily good ones, just agreements. Ways of keeping things moving without drawing attention. The telephone was the perfect tool for that. It didn't require meetings. It didn't leave visible traces. It didn't create witnesses. It connected and then disappeared. And I disappeared with it. That realization began to change the way I saw the town outside the exchange. When I passed someone on the street, I no longer saw just their face, their greeting, their public posture. I also heard the tone they used late at night, the hesitation, the careful phrasing, the familiarity that never appeared in daylight. That made me uncomfortable, not because I knew something shameful about them, but because I was seeing behind something that wasn't meant to be seen from that angle, like stepping backstage at a theater that only works because no one looks behind the curtain. Sometimes I asked myself whether this knowledge was a privilege or a mistake. The job, which once gave me a sense of stability, began to feel like a fragile point, a place where too many things crossed paths without ever fully touching. I was the common point, and that commonality came with no authority at all. I knew too much to be ignorant, but not enough to do anything about it. That position began to exhaust me. There were days I came home with my head full, not of full stories, but of fragments, tones, sequences, repeated hours. I didn't talk about any of it with my wife. I wouldn't have known where to begin. And some things don't ask to be spoken. They accumulate. I tried to convince myself that all of this was simply human nature, that every community has its shadowed corners, that maybe I was romanticizing something ordinary, but that explanation no longer satisfied me. What unsettled me wasn't the content of the calls. It was the way they fit together. I began to sense that certain outcomes felt inevitable long before they happened, as if the town had its own internal logic, one that only revealed itself to someone listening closely enough, long enough. That realization came with an uncomfortable thought. Maybe no one should ever know a town this way, because once you see the full shape, you lose the ability to believe in simple versions. And simple versions are what allowed daily life to continue without becoming unbearably heavy. I still didn't fully grasp what all of this would demand from me, but I felt something closing in, like a door slowly pulling shut its hinges creaking just enough to warn you that reopening it won't be easy. The town was beginning to make too much sense, and when something makes too much sense, it stops being comfortable. That was the period when I stopped thinking of calls as isolated events. I started hearing them as parts of the same long story, a story that wasn't told out loud, but was written every day, wire by wire, voice by voice, and I was in the middle of it without ever having asked to be. I didn't notice right away when the tiredness changed its nature. At first it felt like ordinary fatigue, long hours sitting still, constant attention, the kind of wear that a good night's sleep is supposed to fix. But after a while, I began waking up already tired, as if I'd spent the whole night working, even when I hadn't. My body rested, my mind didn't. I carried the town with me, not in the sense of remembering specific conversations, but in the sense of carrying expectation. Even in silence, I felt like I was waiting for something, a call that wouldn't come, a pattern that hadn't quite finished forming. It was like listening to a low, steady noise you can't locate, not loud enough to panic you, but persistent enough that you can't ignore it. At work, this began to show in small ways. I caught myself watching the board before any light came on. Sometimes I knew which call was coming next, without any technical reason to know it. It wasn't prediction, it was accumulation. Habit turned into anticipation, and anticipation is a form of involvement. I started realizing that I no longer reacted to calls the same way. Outwardly, nothing had changed. My voice stayed even. My hands stayed precise. But inside, some calls demanded more attention than others. Some created a particular tension, like they were announcing something that hadn't happened yet. That troubled me deeply. Because my job had never been about feeling, it had always been about execution. There were days when, at the end of my shift, I sat for a few extra minutes before leaving the exchange, not because there was more work to do, but because I needed time to disconnect, to let the room release me. Even then, when I stepped outside, it felt like I wasn't leaving alone. I tried to explain it to myself in reasonable terms. I told myself this was what experience looked like, that any man who knows his work well enough carries it home in some form. But that explanation started to fall apart when the weight didn't lessen. It increased. I began noticing changes in myself outside the exchange. I listened to people differently, not politely, but analytically. Tone, pauses, small contradictions. Ordinary conversations began to feel incomplete, like something essential was being left out. That kind of listening changes how you exist in a room. At small gatherings, I felt out of place, not because I knew something specific about the people there, but because I couldn't accept them only as the versions they presented. It felt like watching a play, while knowing there was a rehearsal the audience never saw. That awareness doesn't make you superior, it isolates you. At times, I wondered if I was becoming paranoid, if I was assigning meaning where there was none. That doubt stayed with me, and I held on to it like a lifeline. As long as there was doubt, there was still the chance that I was exaggerating. But doubt doesn't erase perception. There was a day when 2 calls came in less than an hour apart. Different people, different matters, but there was a continuity between them that made me pause before connecting the second call, not because I knew exactly what was happening, but because I understood that one depended on the other. That understanding should not have been available to me. I connected the call, did my job, but something shifted inside me at that moment. I realized I was no longer just a passive observer. I was tracking processes, following decisions. Even without participating, I was present too deeply to remain neutral. That realization scared me, not because I wanted to act, but because I knew I wouldn't. I began to see there was no clean exit. Asking for a transfer would raise questions. Showing discomfort would mean admitting involvement. Pretending nothing was happening required more effort every day. Ignorance once lost doesn't come back by choice. At home, the strain began to surface more clearly. I arrived quieter than before, not withdrawn exactly, contained. I was afraid of letting something slip, not information but posture, a look, a hesitation. My wife noticed. She always noticed before I did. At first she asked gently, was I tired? Was work heavier than usual? Had something happened? I answered truthfully in the narrowest sense. I said everything was normal, and it was. That was the problem. How do you explain that nothing has happened, and yet everything has changed? Over time, she stopped asking and started observing. I saw it in the way she looked at me a second longer before returning to what she was doing, in how carefully she maintained the routines of the house, as if stability itself might compensate for what she didn't understand. That attention unsettled me, not because I felt accused, but because I knew there was something I couldn't share. Not for lack of trust, but because I didn't know how to explain it without dragging the entire town into our living room. Some things don't belong in a small house. I realized I was bringing my work home without meaning to. Not stories, not names, but a posture, a constant internal alertness that never shut off. I listened to the sounds of the house the way I listened to voices at the exchange. Her footsteps, the way she closed drawers, the tone she used when she said my name. That wasn't fair to her. But I didn't know how to stop. There were nights when we sat together in the same quiet we'd always shared, but the silence had changed texture. Before, it rested. Now, it restrained. I held back thoughts that didn't have clear shape. She held back questions that didn't know where to land. Silence, which had once been a comfort, was becoming fragile ground. Sometimes I caught myself looking at her and thinking of two versions at once. The woman I had known for years, and the woman whose voice I had never heard on the phone. That thought frightened me more than anything I'd heard at work. That was where I drew the line. She could not be part of this. I began policing myself, avoiding even casual talk about my day, steering conversations away from anything that might lead too close to my work, not because there was something concrete to hide, but because I feared that attention might open something in me that wouldn't close again. She felt that barrier, not as rejection, but as absence. Sometimes she started to say something and stopped. Other times she filled the space with talk that didn't matter, just to keep the room from going quiet in the wrong way. That created a new kind of tension. There were no arguments, no accusations, just a distance that didn't have a name, but grew easier to feel every day. A distance built from care taken too far, words measured too closely, questions not asked. I told myself it was temporary, that things would settle, but deep down, I understood that some shifts don't correct themselves. They require a choice. And I didn't see a choice that wouldn't make something worse. There were nights when I woke suddenly with the feeling that I'd forgotten something important. Not a task, not a date, something larger, more diffuse. I lay there listening to her breathing beside me and thought about how much our normal life depended on my continued silence. That realization carried a quiet guilt, not the guilt of wrongdoing, the guilt of someone changing without permission. I didn't want the town to enter our home. I didn't want the weight of what I heard to touch what still worked between us. But carrying something heavy for too long changes the way you stand. Even when you don't notice it happening, the house was no longer a complete refuge. It was another place where I had to maintain control. And at that point, I began to understand that the impact of my work wouldn't stay contained within the exchange. It was spreading slowly, touching the edges of my personal life, demanding a kind of balance I had never learned how to keep. I didn't yet know where that would lead, but I knew that silence, which had once been a choice, was becoming a necessity, and living that way, holding things that can't be spoken, exacts a cost, even when no one points a finger, especially when no one does. The house had always been the place where things slowed down, not where life stopped entirely, but where it softened. Work stayed outside, Worries settled into their corners. The rhythm inside those walls was steadier, more forgiving. For years, I depended on that separation without ever naming it. I only understood what the house meant when it started to fail me. At first, the change was too subtle to put into words. I came home at the same hour, sat in the same chair. Supper was served the same way, at the same time. The radio stayed on low, like it always had. Everything looked familiar, but I was different inside that familiarity. When my wife spoke to me, I took longer to answer. Not because I wasn't listening, but because I had to travel back from somewhere before responding. Sometimes I answered too precisely, too briefly, as if I were trying to avoid any turn in the conversation that might open into something larger. She noticed. She always noticed these things before I did. At first, she asked casually if I was tired, if work had been heavy, if anything out of the ordinary had happened. I answered with narrow honesty. I said things were fine, and they were. In the most literal sense, nothing had happened. That was what made it so hard to explain. Over time, she stopped asking and started watching. I saw it in the way she looked at me an extra second before turning back to what she was doing, in how carefully she kept the house running, as if perfect order might make up for something she couldn't identify. Her attention wasn't sharp or suspicious. It was gentle, and that made it harder to bear. That kind of quiet awareness unsettles you, not because you feel accused, but because you know you're withholding something without knowing how to release it safe. I became aware of how much of my posture came home with me. Not information, not stories, but a stance, a vigilance that didn't shut off. I listened to the house the way I listened to the exchange, the way she moved across the floor, the sound of cupboards closing, the tone she used when she said my name. That wasn't fair to her, but fairness requires choice, and I didn't feel like I had one. There were evenings when we sat together in the same quiet we'd shared for years. Only now the silence felt different. Before, it rested. Now, it held. I was holding back thoughts that had no clean shape. She was holding back questions that didn't yet know where to land. Silence, which had once been a comfort, had become something delicate. I could feel myself guarding it. In some moments, I caught myself looking at her as if there were two versions present at once. The woman I had built a life with, and the woman whose voice I had never heard pass through the exchange. That thought frightened me more than any conversation I had ever connected. That was where the boundary formed. She could not be drawn into this. I started policing myself without realizing it. I avoided mentioning work at all, even in harmless ways. I changed the subject when conversations drifted too close to my day, not because there was a secret I needed to protect, but because I feared the act of explaining would pull something loose in me that wouldn't settle again. She felt that withdrawal, not as rejection, but as absence. Sometimes she started to speak and stopped midway. Other times, she filled the space with talk that didn't matter. Stories about errands, neighbors, small observations, anything to keep the silence from settling too heavily between us. That created a new kind of strain. There were no arguments, no accusations, no raised voices, just a distance that didn't have a name, but grew easier to feel. A distance made of care taken too far, of words measured too closely, of questions never asked. I tried to tell myself it was temporary, that things would realign on their own, but deep down, I knew better. Some changes don't correct themselves. They require a decision, and every decision I could imagine carried its own damage. There were nights when I woke suddenly with the sensation that I'd forgotten something important. Not an appointment, not an obligation, something larger, more diffuse. I lay there listening to her breathing beside me and thought about how much our normal life depended on my silence. That thought brought a quiet guilt with it. Not the guilt of someone who has done wrong, but the guilt of someone who knows they are changing without asking permission. I didn't want the town to enter our house. I didn't want the weight of what I heard to contaminate what still worked between us. But carrying something heavy for too long alters the way you stand, even when you don't realize it's happening. I became more careful in public, too. I measured even casual remarks, avoided unnecessary comments. Not out of fear, but out of habit. I no longer trusted words to be harmless. That caution reshaped who I was outside the exchange. My wife noticed, even without understanding. She knew me well enough to sense the shift, but also well enough to know that pressing harder would only make things worse. One night, she asked me something more direct than usual. She didn't ask if I was tired, or if work was stressful. She asked if I was happy. The question caught me off guard, not because I was unhappy, but because the question required a simplicity I no longer had. I said things were fine, that there was no reason to worry. She accepted the answer, but I could tell it didn't settle for her. After that, she stopped asking. This new silence was different from the old one. It wasn't comfort, it was adaptation. She was adjusting to a version of me that even I didn't fully understand yet, and that realization cut deeper than anything else. I began to understand that the consequences of my work weren't staying inside the exchange. They were spreading, slowly and quietly, touching the edges of my life at home. What I carried during the day didn't disappear at night. It simply changed shape. The house was no longer a complete refuge. It had become another place where I had to be careful, and in that understanding, something settled into place inside me. The silence I had once chosen was no longer optional. It was a defense, a way of keeping things from breaking apart before I knew how to hold them. I didn't know yet what that would cost in the long run, but I knew the house, like the exchange, was now part of the same structure. And once everything is connected, there is no place left that remains untouched. When the news finally moved through town, it didn't arrive like a shock. It arrived like confirmation. There were no sirens, no rush in the streets, no sudden gathering of people trying to understand what had just happened. It spread the way things always spread in a small town, first as a passing comment, then as a quiet certainty, until it became something everyone accepted as real. Most people said it had come out of nowhere. For me, it hadn't. I had heard the beginning of it long before anyone realized there was something beginning at all. Not as a complete story, not as a decision already made, but as a slow alignment of voices, pauses, and careful confirmations. At the time, I didn't know exactly what was being prepared. I only knew that something was. The first call came outside the usual pattern. Short, controlled, almost polite in a way that felt deliberate. The voice on the other end moved carefully, choosing simple words, avoiding specifics. Nothing dramatic was said, but there was concern there. The kind that doesn't ask for advice, only for acknowledgement. In the days that followed, other calls appeared. They didn't seem connected on the surface. Different people, different reasons, different times of day, but they carried the same careful tone, the same sense of adjustment, as if each person were testing the ground, making sure it would hold before taking another step. I listened without understanding the full shape of it, but I understood enough to know it wasn't random. When a third call came, from someone who rarely used the phone at that hour, I felt a tightening in my chest. Not fear, recognition. The voice wasn't asking a question. It was aligning itself with something already in motion. That was when I knew something was being arranged. Still, I couldn't see the end of it, and I didn't need to. What unsettled me was not the outcome, but the process, the way it was being stretched out, diluted into small conversations spaced carefully over time. No single call revealed anything on its own. Together they carried direction. That's how the town handled difficult things. Quietly, carefully, without drawing a line anyone could point to and say, that's where it started. When the event finally became public, a decision made, a separation announced, a change that reached into several households at once. The reaction was measured. People spoke in lowered voices. Some expressed surprise. Others nodded as if they'd half expected it. A few shook their heads and said it was a shame. Everyone moved on quickly. I listened to those reactions with a strange sense of distance. They made sense. They just weren't the whole story. People said it was sudden, that circumstances had forced it, that there had been no other option. All of that was partly true, but I knew how carefully each step had been tested before it was taken. I had heard the doubts raised and softened, the hesitations that were never called doubts, the permissions that were never named as such. None of that appeared now. Out in the open, the event stood alone, stripped of its preparation. It looked clean, almost simple, something that had happened because it had to. I knew better. I had heard it being assembled. As I moved through town in the days that followed, I paid attention to the people most directly affected, the way they talked about it, the care with which they chose words. Some sounded relieved, others sounded guarded. No one said exactly what they felt. That wasn't unusual. It was expected. What was new was the way I experienced it. I wasn't sharing the shock. I was carrying the memory of anticipation. That difference created a quiet separation between me and everyone else. I crossed paths with people involved and felt an unease I couldn't explain out loud. Not because I knew intimate details, but because I knew the path that had led them there. I had heard the moments when they tried to delay things, the calls made to soften the impact, the effort put into making the outcome feel inevitable rather than chosen. They were living with the consequence. I was living with the knowledge of how long it had taken to arrive. A few days after the announcement, I connected a call from someone directly touched by the event. The voice was tired, not angry, not surprised, just worn down. There was no urgency in the conversation, no careful phrasing, only acceptance. As I plugged the cord into the board, I felt something close inside me, not relief, completion. Something that had started weeks earlier had reached its end. For the first time, I understood that what I heard at the exchange didn't stay there. It moved outward. It took shape. It altered lives. The telephone wasn't just where the town talked. It was where the town rehearsed, and I had been present for the rehearsal. That realization changed how I saw my role. Up until then, I had managed to believe that listening didn't equal involvement, that I was simply a technical point, a necessary passage. But seeing the result of those calls standing in the open made that belief harder to hold. I hadn't caused what happened, but I had accompanied it. That distinction no longer felt clean. Back at the exchange, everything continued as usual. Lights blinked, cords moved, new conversations replaced old ones. But now each call carried the potential of becoming something more, another preparation, another quiet alignment. The exchange felt different after that. Not louder, heavier. It felt like a place where futures passed through in pieces before becoming solid. At home, my wife mentioned the event the way everyone else did, casually, without detail. She said she'd heard about it, said it was unfortunate, said things seemed to be changing too fast lately. I listened. She was encountering the news in the present tense. I was encountering it as something already lived. Everything she said was new to her. None of it was new to me, and that gap between first hearing and last understanding widened the distance I already felt. I had to be careful not to react too strongly, not to let familiarity show where it didn't belong, not to reveal a depth of knowledge that would raise questions I couldn't answer. Not out of fear, out of restraint. The event didn't bring clarity. It didn't draw clean lines between right and wrong. It didn't resolve anything neatly. It simply confirmed what I had already learned. The town moved according to processes that preferred to stay invisible, and the telephone was where those processes took form. And I was positioned there, listening to all of it, without ever being asked to respond. That position no longer felt temporary. I began to understand that the arcs of my life were starting to overlap in ways I couldn't separate. The work, the marriage, the town itself. Everything was connected by something I couldn't shut off. The event hadn't shocked me. It had verified me. It proved that what I was hearing wasn't imagination. It wasn't exaggeration. It was real movement, real consequence, real impact. Something had crossed from the wires into the world. And once that happens, you can no longer pretend that listening is harmless. You may not act, you may not speak, but you carry it. And carrying it changes you. That was the moment I understood the story was no longer just being shaped. It had begun to move, and when things move beyond the place where you can observe them safely, the weight changes. What had once been tension became responsibility, and I still didn't know how long I could hold it without leaving marks. After the event, I tried to return to the old rhythm, not because I believed it was truly possible, but because it was the only rhythm I knew how to live by. I kept waking up at the same hour, walking the same streets, sitting in the same chair at the exchange, adjusting the same board, plugging in the same chords. From the outside, nothing had changed, and that in itself felt important to the town. Towns like things to stay recognizable. Inside me, though, something had settled in. I no longer listened to calls, waiting only for them to end. I listened, knowing that any one of them could be the beginning of something that wouldn't reveal itself for weeks. That constant possibility created a new kind of tension. It wasn't fear, it was vigilance, the kind that doesn't let you rest, even when nothing is happening. And vigilance wears you down. I began thinking of the telephone not as a tool, but as a space. A place where people tested decisions before standing behind them, where doubts were spoken out loud without commitment, where intentions were placed into the world carefully enough that they could still be taken back if needed. I was present for all of it. That forced me to face a truth I had been avoiding. Listening was no longer passive for me. It had become involvement, even if it remained silent. I didn't choose what came through the lines, but I chose to keep sitting there day after day. That choice, repeated long enough, carried weight. For the first time, I questioned the code I had lived by since the beginning. What passes through the lines doesn't belong to you. It had worked when the work was simple, when listening hadn't produced consequences I could see. Now it sounded incomplete, because when something passes through you long enough, it leaves marks, even if you don't want it to, even if you never speak of it. I realized I was carrying a version of the town that couldn't be shared with anyone. Not because it was shocking, but because it was complicated, full of adjustments, half steps, small choices that added up to large outcomes. That version didn't fit into casual conversation. It didn't fit into quick explanations. And it didn't fit into easy judgments. That knowledge isolated me. At the exchange, I felt increasingly alone, even surrounded by voices. Other operators worked their shifts, followed procedures, went home. Maybe they noticed things, maybe they didn't. I never asked. Asking would have meant acknowledging something out loud. At home, the silence grew heavier. My wife was still there, steady, attentive, doing her best to preserve the life we had built. But I could feel that something between us had shifted in a permanent way, not broken, tilted, like a picture frame that's been knocked slightly out of line and never quite sits straight again. I was afraid of speaking too much, and afraid of saying nothing at all. That tension followed me constantly. In simple conversations, I measured words. In moments of closeness, I pulled back, not because I wanted distance from her, but because I didn't know how to explain the weight I carried without placing it in her hands as well, and that felt wrong. There was a night when I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, turning one question over and over in my mind. How far does the responsibility of the listener go? Not in a legal sense, not in an abstract moral sense, in a human sense. If you hear something before everyone else, do you owe anything to that knowledge? Or is the duty precisely to remain silent so that things can follow their natural course? And who decides what that course is? There were no clear answers. Maybe there never were, but the fact that I was asking those questions at all showed how far I had moved from the man who once believed his job was purely technical. I came to understand that absolute neutrality is a comforting idea, but a fragile one. It works only until you see what listening produces. Once you see the consequences, neutrality begins to crack. There was no dramatic moment of decision, no scene where I almost acted and then stopped myself. What happened instead was slower and heavier, an acceptance that I had already been changed by this work. Regardless of what I did next, I had become someone who knew too much to be naive and was too quiet to be influential. That position felt like a kind of confinement. The town continued functioning. People kept calling. New concerns replaced old ones. New situations began taking shape in lowered voices. I listened with the same efficiency as always, but with a different awareness. Each call reinforced the understanding that this wasn't an isolated episode. It was a system, and systems don't depend on one person's conscience. That realization brought an unexpected clarity. I wasn't indispensable as an individual. If I left, someone else would sit at the board. The calls would continue. The town would go on. What mattered wasn't me. It was the function. The listening, the passage. That stripped away any illusion of heroism, but it also stripped away total guilt. I was part of something larger than myself, and that came without honor or condemnation, only consequence. Slowly I accepted that the greatest impact of all this wouldn't be public. There would be no revelation, no recognition. The real effect was happening inside me, reshaping how I saw the world, how I saw people, how I understood myself. I was becoming someone who carried too much and spoke too little. And at that point, I understood something I had only sensed before. Knowing is not neutral when knowledge has nowhere to go, when it can't be shared, resolved, or forgotten. It settles. It organizes. It demands space. In my case, that space was internal. I still didn't know how it would end, but I knew I had reached the limit of what could simply be observed. Not in the sense of action, but in the sense of endurance. Something would have to adjust, or something would have to give, and that understanding, the quiet certainty that I had been changed in a way that could not be reversed, was the heaviest moment of all, because there was no return, and there was no clean exit. There was only continuation. There came a point when I stopped trying to organize things. It wasn't a conscious decision. It felt more like letting go of something I'd been holding too tightly for too long. I stopped replaying old calls in my head, stopped trying to remember the exact order certain voices had appeared, stopped looking for explanations that might make the whole thing easier to live with, because by then it was already clear enough. I didn't need to fit the pieces together anymore. The picture was complete. The work, the house, the town, they weren't separate things. They were parts of the same structure. Not a conspiracy, not a deliberate scheme, just a way of functioning that survives precisely because it's never named out loud. Each part did its job without questioning the whole, and I had been placed right in the middle of it, not by ambition, not by choice, but by suitability. I was the kind of man who didn't make noise. Looking back, I understand how important that was. A system like that doesn't need brilliance. It needs steadiness. It needs someone who shows up, follows procedure, doesn't draw attention, doesn't ask for explanations that can't be given. That was me. When I thought about the event that had crossed the town, I no longer saw it as an isolated moment. It was simply the most visible point in a long, quiet process. A process I had listened to take shape, piece by piece, adjustment though by adjustment. That understanding brought no relief. It brought sadness, not sharp, not dramatic, but steady, the kind that settles in your chest and stays there. Not sadness for any one person, but for the clarity that comes too late to change anything. I began to see the telephone differently. It didn't just reveal the town, it made the town possible. Without the phone, certain things would have required face-to-face meetings, confrontations, explanations, witnesses. The phone allowed distance. It allowed deniability. It allowed people to act without fully stepping into the consequences until much later. And I was the one making sure those lines stayed open. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with a quiet sense of loss. Because once you see that, you can't pretend your role is small anymore, even if no one else sees it that way. At home, that clarity reached me in a different form. I began to understand just how much my wife had adapted to my silence, not because she was weak, not because she was afraid to ask, but because she trusted me enough to accept that I was carrying something I didn't know how to share. She had adjusted her expectations, her questions, her tone. She had made room for a version of me that arrived home every night a little heavier than before, and she did it without demanding explanations. That realization struck me harder than anything I'd heard at the exchange, because there was someone else carrying weight she hadn't chosen, and she was doing it quietly, out of loyalty rather than obligation. I understood then that silence is never neutral inside a marriage. It shapes things. It creates distance. It requires sacrifice. Everything I did to protect the outside world had consequences inside the house. And yet even with that awareness, I still didn't know how to change it without breaking something else. The town, meanwhile, kept moving. New concerns replaced old ones. New rumors rose and fell. The event that had once felt so heavy began to fade into memory, reduced to a simplified version that fit into casual conversation. That's what time does. It sands things down until they're safe to touch. I listened to those new stories forming, dissolving, rearranging themselves. The exchange remained the place where it all passed through before becoming real, and I remained there. Over time, I understood that my greatest mistake had been believing listening was purely technical, that I could hear without absorbing, that I could witness without being changed. That belief had sustained me for years. It didn't survive completeness, because once you hear enough, for long enough, you begin to understand too much, and understanding too much changes how you inhabit the world. I could no longer talk to people without also hearing what they weren't saying. I could no longer accept simple explanations without sensing the layers beneath them. That didn't make me wiser. It made me tired. Clarity isn't always liberating. Sometimes it's heavy. There was an afternoon when I sat alone at the exchange for a moment longer than usual, watching the board in silence. Lights blinked on and off. Chords moved. The system functioned exactly as it always had, and for the first time, I understood something with complete certainty. That place wasn't just where I worked. It was where I had become who I was. Everything in me had passed through that room. My view of the town, my distance at home, my careful way of existing, all of it had been shaped by years of listening without responding, and that led me to an acceptance that surprised me with its calm. There was no villain to confront, no truth to reveal, no justice waiting at the end. There was only coherence. The coherence of understanding that some people spend their entire lives sustaining structures they'll never be acknowledged for. Not out of heroism, but function. Not because they believe in the outcome, but because someone has to hold the middle. I wasn't special. I was suitable. That realization didn't free me, but it aligned me. I stopped fighting the shape my life had taken. I stopped wishing I could return to the man I'd been before. That man had existed because he didn't know what I now knew, and knowledge doesn't release you backward. At home, I began paying closer attention to what still held, not trying to fix what had shifted, but honoring what remained. Shared meals, small gestures, a silence that, while changed, still contained care. I understood then that what kept us together wasn't complete transparency. It was trust, and trust doesn't always require words. In the town, I remained largely invisible, greeted politely, forgotten easily, just the man from the exchange, nothing more. And maybe that was how it needed to be, because if someone had looked at me too closely, they might have seen something they weren't meant to see. They might have realized I understood the whole pattern, and that understanding wouldn't have helped anyone. In the end, everything connected not to offer resolution, but to form a complete portrait of who I had become. A man who listens, a man who understands, a man who stays. That's staying. Quiet, uncelebrated, unseen, was the natural consequence of everything I had lived through. I didn't know exactly how the story would end, but I knew the ending wouldn't arrive as revelation. It would arrive as continuation. And by then, I was ready for that. Over time, I learned that some things don't end. They don't break. They don't explode. They don't resolve themselves into neat conclusions. They settle. There wasn't a particular morning when I woke up feeling different. No clear turning point. No decision that marked the change. What happened was quieter than that. It was an adjustment so gradual I didn't notice it happening until it was already complete. I kept going to the exchange. The building stayed the same. The board stayed the same. The lights blinked the way they always had. The cords hung with the same familiar weight. To anyone watching from the outside, I was the same man doing the same work, day after day, and in a practical sense, that was true. But I was no longer searching for understanding. I had spent too much time trying to organize what I heard, trying to make sense of how everything fit together, trying to find a meaning large enough to justify the weight of it all. At some point, I realized the meaning wasn't in knowing everything. It was in accepting limits, accepting that some knowledge doesn't ask to be used, it asks to be carried. I stopped anticipating quite so much, not because the patterns disappeared, but because I no longer needed to chase them. I recognized them when they passed, acknowledged them, and let them go. That wasn't indifference, it was conservation. Attention costs something, and I had learned, slowly and painfully, that not every cost can be paid every day without consequence. The calls continued. New voices, old voices, familiar tones returning after long absences. Situations formed, adjusted, dissolved. The town remained itself, complicated, ordinary, quietly functional. I connected the calls. I unplugged the cords. I kept the flow moving. That was still my role. At home, life found a different balance. My wife and I never returned to what we had been before. That kind of return doesn't happen when something real shifts. But we found a way forward that didn't require explanations for everything. We learned to value presence over clarity, a shared meal, a glance across the room, silence that didn't need defending. I stopped thinking of her as someone I needed to protect from the world I heard. She had her own ways of carrying things, her own quiet strengths. I had underestimated that before. The house became a place where I could breathe again, not because the weight was gone, but because I stopped fighting it. The town, meanwhile, kept aging. Children grew, people moved away, others passed on. Businesses changed hands, streets were repaved. The event that once felt so heavy faded into a simplified memory, retold without detail, without context, without its long preparation. That's how towns survive. They forget just enough. I heard new stories begin. I heard others dissolve before they ever became visible. The exchange remained the place where everything passed through before becoming solid, and I remained there, unnoticed. Sometimes I wondered if anyone understood how fragile that structure was, how much depended on people not looking too closely, not asking too many questions, not insisting on full explanations. But those thoughts no longer troubled me the way they once had. I had learned something essential. Not every truth needs a stage. Some truths exist only to shape the person who carries them. I never told anyone what I heard, not because I was afraid, not because I felt guilty, but because I respected the role I had been given, or perhaps the role I had grown into. With time, I understood that my function was never to reveal, it was to sustain, not to agree with what passed through the lines, but to keep the lines open. Someone had to do that, and I had done it. There was no recognition, no thanks, no reckoning. There was continuity, and unexpectedly, that was enough. Years later, many years later, there came a day when I sat at the exchange for the last time. There was no ceremony, no speech. I shut down the board the way I always did, put things in order, left the room ready for whoever would sit there next. The town didn't pause. It didn't need to. Someone else would take the chair. The calls would keep coming. The voices would keep moving through the wires. The structure would hold because it was built to outlast individuals. When I stepped outside, I walked the same streets I'd walked for most of my adult life. I passed familiar faces, returned greetings. Nothing marked the moment as significant, but I knew I carried a version of that town no one else carried in quite the same way. That knowledge didn't make me proud. It didn't make me bitter. It simply made me quiet. Today, when I think back on it all, I don't think about secrets. I think about systems. I think about silence. I think about the people who spend their lives holding things together without ever being named for it. The phone rings, someone answers, voices move on, and the town keeps working. So do I, in my own way. I did what needed to be done, even before I understood why it mattered. Some things only make sense after enough time has passed. In the end, there was no revelation, no redemption, no final judgment. There was coherence, and sometimes that's all a life offers.